There are people that nobody likes. They don't even realize nobody likes them. And then there are people who know nobody likes them. I was the second one. Nobody liked me, and I really didn't care. Even when I was little. Well, I've always been little. I mean, even when I was a boy, I never really had praise. I was small. But what I lacked in stature, I made up in intelligence and cunning. I mean, I was ruthless and mean. Becoming a tax collector seemed perfectly natural. People hated me anyway, and cheating them seemed like a great way to get back at them. But then he came to town. Everybody was talking about him. And well, I wanted to see him too. But seriously, how am I supposed to see over anyone? I mean, really. But then I spotted, right there along the road, a sycamore tree. So I climbed it so that I could see him too. And as Jesus walked up to where I was, he looked right up at me, almost like he was expecting to see a grown man in a tree. And he talked to me and called me by name, Zacchaeus. He knew my name. And if that wasn't enough, he went and invited himself to my house. You should have heard everyone. They couldn't believe that he would eat with someone like me. But he did. And I will never be the same.
Well, it's a familiar story. We've known it since Sunday school. Rich tax collector, head of the regional tax bureau, curious about Jesus. Jesus comes through town surrounded by crowds. Zacchaeus is not tall enough to see over the crowd, so he climbs into a sycamore tree to get a better look. Jesus stops, looks up at him, calls him by name, invites himself to be a guest in his home. That's where the story ends, right? That's where the song ends. For I'm going to your house today. That's not where the story ends. There's so much more to his story than that. So much more to his up-close and personal encounter with Jesus. And I want to walk us through the heart of his encounter with Jesus, and I want to do it in what I hope will be kind of a fun, different way this morning. You see, the process of preparing a sermon obviously begins with choosing a topic or a text. And then a very important part of that is to identify the main idea of that passage. What is the essential truth or the essential truths about God, about the nature and needs of mankind that the story of encounter highlights? Once the answers to those questions start forming in my mind, the next challenge, or one of the next challenges, is to come up with a title. A few words or a short phrase that accurately reflect those truths, and if in the process that short phrase can kind of capture attention, generate interest, or arouse curiosity, if there's a little twist or play on words, that's even better. So today I want to talk about the story of Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus, but I want to talk about it in terms of four titles. Three of them that I didn't choose, and the one that I did, that say something about the heart of this sermon. And what I feel each of those titles contributes to our understanding of this story. You ready? It's going to be a little shorter this morning. Some of you got that. Sorry. Because I knew I was going to share some other things, and so I think we can do this, and it can be still meaningful to us. So I've already tipped my hand a little bit. One of the titles that I thought about was a title called Short on Grace. So a little grown, that's appropriate. That was the world that Zacchaeus lived in, not just the short parts. That's what he's known for partly. But there's so much more than that. Understand the world that he lived in. First of all, the overall Jewish culture was short on grace, thanks to the legalism and elitism of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That was the context. You better keep these rules. It was about rules and ritual. There wasn't much grace there. But for Zacchaeus, it went much further than that. We don't find out just how short on grace it was for Zacchaeus until we see and hear the crowd react to him and Jesus walking off together on the way to the tax collector's house. The translation we read from this morning, but the people were displeased. He's gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner. They grumbled. Zacchaeus had a reputation. People didn't like him. He was one of them. He was categorized. He was judged. He was found wanting. He didn't measure up in more ways than stature in their eyes. So there is a sense in which Zacchaeus' story is a story of being short on grace. But that title certainly doesn't tell the whole story of the encounter. So let's scrap that one. Maybe it's just the opposite. Maybe the title should be No Shortage of Grace. You say, well, that wasn't exactly his experience until Jesus showed up. Now that'll preach. When Jesus comes, there is no shortage of grace. It's interesting. We shared last week and again this week, and it doesn't always jump out in the same way, but even as the gospel writers are writing down these events, and sometimes they match up with each other and sometimes they don't, but I am very, very convinced that as they were writing, they were mindful of the way these, especially for Matthew, Mark, and John, but Luke, as he's hearing these stories by investigation, as he talks with the disciples, as he talks with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and as he gives human interest perspectives that the other gospel writers don't give. And as he is impacted by hearing those stories, and then he puts together this record of the life of Christ, I don't think it's by accident that the chapter before what are we in? 17, 18, 19. There we go. The chapter 18 has two interesting accounts. One of them is the story that, again, only appears in Luke, that Jesus tells about two men in the temple. One of them was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. Was that accidental that Luke shares that story and how the Pharisee bragged about how righteous he was, and the tax collector said, God, have mercy on me, I'm a sinner? And Jesus told his listeners, who prided themselves in their own righteousness, Luke tells us, that it was the second, it was the tax collector who went home right with God. And as we're reading through Luke, we hear that story. Was it true? Was it really based on something that really happened? Was it just something that Jesus made up the story that still has truth in it? We don't know. But Luke tells it before he tells us the story about this particular tax collector. There's no shortage of grace when Jesus shows up. Grace even to a lowly tax collector. That the Pharisee, who was very short on grace, as he prayed and he thanked God for all of his own righteousness and all of his own good deeds, he looks over and says, I thank you that I'm not like this tax collector. God's grace had room for that tax collector and for Zacchaeus. So maybe no shortage on grace. Maybe I'll go with that. But there's still something missing. Because grace has value just on its own merits. But in the outworking of God's plan and purpose, grace is not the end of the story. Grace is what brings a new beginning. And the heart of this story, the big news of this story is not that there was a tax collector that nobody liked. That wasn't news. The big news of this story is not that Zacchaeus wasn't very tall. That's not really newsworthy. The big news of this story is not that he was resourceful and he climbed up in a tree to see Jesus. That's not news. The big news of this story is that something happened in Zacchaeus when he met Jesus. So I thought of the title. It sounded kind of catchy in my head. Keep the change. See, there's this money thing, tax collector thing, and although I'm sure nobody ever came up to Zacchaeus and said, here's what I owe and keep the change. But you know what Zacchaeus said after he met Jesus? Whether it was on the way to his house, whether it was after they'd been there for a while, Luke just says, meanwhile, after all the people grumbled and said, I can't believe Jesus would go to the house of such a notorious sinner, it just says, meanwhile. Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, I will give half of my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. And whereas I believe no one in paying their taxes ever said to Zacchaeus, keep the change, this new Zacchaeus that I see in paying back said, hey, I cheated you on this, here's 4 times as much, and keep the change. I think that was now part of his new repertoire. And of course, this title also speaks of the change that happened in Zacchaeus, and that's really the piece that was missing. But I really like the grace. So I came up with another title. And that's what's in the bulletin. Grace for a Change. You know what? It seemed to touch all the bases. I don't know why I've got baseball in my mind. Something big happened with the Phillies. It touched all the bases because grace coming into Zacchaeus' life was something new for him. It was a change. It wasn't what he normally experienced from people. So the grace that Jesus brought was a change. And so this story speaks of grace for a change in a world of abuse and judgment. But it also speaks of what grace accomplishes. Far more than judgment ever will. His grace is what motivated the change in Zacchaeus. An experience with Jesus that said, I know you and I welcome you. I want to be with you. I have plans for you. There's something about that grace that completely undid all of this rough, conniving, I've got to get them for what they did to me. Whatever it was in motivating Zacchaeus, suddenly that all was washed away. And this infusion of grace in his life just changed him from the inside out. And that's what grace does. The grace that Jesus extended was responsible for a change in the way the grace that Jesus extended was a change in the way Zacchaeus was normally treated. The grace that Jesus extended was a catalyst for the change on the inside of Zacchaeus that made him want to make things right with others. You see, grace doesn't say, because I love you, it doesn't matter what you do. Grace says, I love you, and because I love you, everything you do matters. I don't think Jesus had to lecture Zacchaeus on what was right, what was wrong. Rather, his presence, his grace lit that flame. Zacchaeus knew what was right. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew how to treat other people. He knew it didn't matter how they treated him. It didn't matter any of that. His life was changed. He'd experienced grace in such a powerful way that he wanted to be grace to the world around him. The Apostle Paul, traveling companion of Luke, no doubt heard this story and was touched by it in some ways. In his letter to Titus, the young pastor, he wrote these words. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, to live self-controlled, upright lives, godly lives in this present age. Now wait a minute, what did he say teaches us? It's grace. It doesn't say the threat of judgment has appeared to us. No, that's been around all through human history. No, it's grace that appeared. And grace that teaches us. Grace that motivates us to be a people of God's very own, eager to do what is good. Eugene Peterson, in his Message translation, put it this way: God's readiness to give and forgive. What a great definition of grace. God's readiness to give and forgive is now public. It's been revealed. It's made known. God's readiness to give and forgive is now public. Salvation is available for everyone. We're being shown how to turn our backs on a godless, indulgent life and how to take on a God-filled, God-honoring life. This new life is starting right now, and it's whetting our appetites for the glorious day when our great God and Savior Jesus Christ appears. He offered himself as a sacrifice to free us from a dark, rebellious life into this good, pure life, making us a people he can be proud of, energetic in goodness. Grace for a change. That's what God wants to do in our lives. To change for the better. Turn us around to have us encounter him, encounter that grace firsthand, that it might fill us and change us and define us in the way we live in this world. May Zacchaeus' story be our story.